Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by David Weinberg. David, thank you so much for joining the briefing.
My honor.
So David is a regular contributor to the IDSF Research Department and the Senior Managing Fellow at the Miskav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy in Jerusalem. Has a regular column in many publications, and I hope to share one of those articles today as we progress through our briefing. And David, you're also a wine connoisseur, correct?
That's my passion, yes.
Okay, so maybe as we end the briefing, you'll give us some Israeli wine recommendations. But let's jump into it right now. We've focused a lot in these briefings and in general in the those of us following Israeli national security issues on the U.S. transition in the administration and the implications that has to Israel. We're very focused on the U.S. right now. But can you share with us a little bit about Israeli resilience and the need for potentially Israeli independence from the U.S.? What are your thoughts on all of that?
Sure. We could start with wine. That would be my preference, and get to the defense strategy later. But since you asked, let's go back a decade. Back in 2013, the IDF Chief of Staff promulgated a multi-year plan for the Israeli military called Te'uzah, which means prowess or fearlessness. And the plan accepted a significant decrease in overall funding to the IDF and shifted priorities away from the ground forces in favor of Air Force and cyber capabilities, intelligence, special forces operations, and standoff precision fire. And this amounted to an almost 25% cut in the ground forces over that decade. The IDF Chief of Staff at the time was Benny Gantz. He accepted the relative weakness of the maneuvering capabilities of the Israeli armed forces for the foreseeable future, based on the understanding that the IDF would not have to conduct large-scale maneuvers in enemy territory. Obviously, Gantz and his predecessors and successors, I'm talking about the chiefs of staff like Mofaz, Chalutz, Ya'alon, Ashkenazi, Eisenkot, and Kochavi, all of whom were party to this grand conceptual error to one degree or another. They were dead wrong. It's today quite clear that Israel has to and will have to fight several wars in enemy-held territory over the coming decade. I don't have to explain to you the situation in Gaza or the situation in Lebanon or the situation that we're now facing with regarding Iran. But it's quite clear that the IDF needs to grow significantly. That means, first of all, that Israel needs to develop its own resilience in four main areas. Number one, defense systems. That's development and manufacturing, including munitions. Second of all, critical resources, which is the supply chain for minerals and other scarce materials like steel. Third of all, national security technologies, including AI, homeland and cybersecurity, quantum computing, and space technologies. And fourth of all, perhaps most complex of all, is social cohesion, which means better integrating Arabs, Druze, Bedouin citizens, and Haredi Jews into the national economy and national defense frameworks. Just to give you an example, in the armament sector, Israel needs an estimated 8 times over the current manufacturing capability of the Israeli defense industries. Israel needs to produce every year 10,000 surveillance and attack drones, at least 200 artillery guns, that's known as the Thunder Maker self-propelled artillery gun, 100 armored personnel carriers, it's called the Namer, and 50 main battle tanks every year. It also needs to manufacture its own artillery shells and precision-guided missiles for the Air Force in insane numbers. And this is especially true since Israel faces increasing restrictions on the use of US-supplied weaponry and also because there's a global shortage of such ammunition. Resilience also means ramping up and reinforcing essential services such as hospitals, electricity grids, water and sewage networks, food manufacturing and stockpiling. For example, the Israeli electricity grid has almost no excess capacity. And yet we need many layers of redundancy in case of enemy attack. We must have at hand massive supplies of medicines, food products, core industrial ingredients to last out what could be a 1-year long interruption in air and sea imports. And finally, the IDF itself needs to grow by at least 3 divisions. That's 50,000 soldiers more with tons of military equipment. And there's a gargantuan increase in the training of frontline troops that's necessary, especially the armored formations. And the Israeli Navy is asking for $5 billion in new ships, submarines, weapon systems, and personnel over the next decade. Now, Netanyahu has established a national committee known as the Vadat Nagel, the Nagel Committee, named for its chairman, Dr. Joseph Nagel, who is a former national security advisor. This committee is going to be reporting out by the end of December, according to all indications. The committee is going to recommend an increase in the Israeli defense budget from 5 to 7.5% of GDP. That is a whopping leap in Israeli defense expenditures. That's tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of shekels more. There's no way Israel can afford that unless it takes on more debt, meaning borrowing on the international markets. It's going to affect every other aspect of life in Israel, from health to education to social welfare. That's what resilience means. That's what it's going to cost. We're talking about a situation where Israel almost needs to go into an emergency wartime economy footing. Now, this has been done before. David Ben-Gurion ran Israel in its early years on a wartime economic footing. He threw every immigrant who came into the country off the boat and into weapons manufacturing facilities or into the military. And I think that here too, we're going to have to draft young and old senior citizens and high school students to do all the things I talked about earlier. We're going to have to raid the high schools, university campuses, and senior citizens' homes for manpower. We're going to have to press the Israeli public, young and old, of all hues and stripes, into industrial and emergency service. I think that the public instinctively understands that we're at an inflection point, and there are sacrifices that will yet need to be made, not only on the battlefield, but on the home front, as I just described, to guarantee the country's very existence. And I believe the public, young and old, is ready for that. It's yearning, it's even screaming for national leadership that will motivate it to participate in this escalating national war effort, despite the severity of the costs involved. And I'm not talking about the magnificent civil society initiatives that have been launched by so many people over the last year to support soldiers and their family. All of that is super important. But I'm talking about national mobilization that goes way, way beyond that. We all know Winston Churchill's famous speech back in 1940, when he girded the public of the United Kingdom for an arduous path ahead. Before he drafted every single Briton into war service of one type or another, he told the public that we have an ordeal ahead of us, what he called of the most grievous kind. And I have nothing, he said, to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. It is victory, victory at all costs, said Churchill. Despite all terror, victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival. End quote. I think that Israelis hanker for such leadership today. The emergency mobilization of society and economy, as I've described it here, is certainly necessary, and I think Israelis will be up to the task.
David, thank you. I want to go a little deeper for a moment into your 4 areas of resilience. But before that, let me ask you, have you by chance written an article on this topic of these 4 areas that we can share?
Yeah, I'll be happy to
Wonderful.
send it to you.
Wonderful. Okay, so in terms of these 4 areas of resilience that Israel needs to develop, defense systems, the need for munitions, I think intuitively we can understand that. And certainly in the beginning of the war, with all of the issues of shortage of munitions, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of the IDF needing to increase its manpower, we've clearly seen that with just the length of days and now a year that all of the reservists are being overstrained. But can you elaborate a little bit on the supply chain and the tech development needed? Is there a shortage right now that is being felt and that is restricting the army because there's not adequate steel, as you mentioned, or we do not have advanced technologies being developed?
So the truth is, I can't give you a full answer to your questions because a lot of this is classified. Is Israel facing a critical materials shortage? Steel, for example. I don't know. I would hope not. There is a shortage, for example, of steel on the international market. China is gobbling up, every steel beam it can get its hands on around the world because of the rapid advancement of their economy. The same goes for critical raw materials and chemicals and so on. On the technology side, Israel's okay. Israel has a robust military technologies sector, as well as cyber technology and medical technology and so on, as is well known. That's true of homeland security, space technologies, and so on. Of course, the tech sector is dependent on international partnerships, on capital coming in, on the ability to travel the world and see colleagues and have colleagues come here. And we all know that has been somewhat affected over the last year because of the war situation. It's very hard to get a flight in and out of Israel right now because most international carriers are not flying into Israel. And the Israeli carriers are overbooked, overburdened, and the prices are simply insane.
100%. Okay, and then that other area of resilience I didn't mention, social cohesion. I think, again, we understand in society and civil life why social cohesion is important. Can you explain why, as a matter of the war effort, social cohesion is needed and what exactly that means?
Well, let's start with the good news. Many people feared that in the context of our current wars with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, the Israeli Arab sector would rise up in revolt. Just 5 years ago, in what was known as Shomer HaChamot, we had an Israeli Arab uprising in the Galilee and Negev and in other mixed cities such as Lod and Ramwa, and which was very violent. And there were a lot of concerns that under the cover of this war, Israel would be facing an internal front as well with Israeli Arab rioting, Israeli Arab terrorism, and so on. By and large, thank God, that has not been the case. Can have a long discussion of why that's the case, why that hasn't happened. The fact is that it hasn't happened. Now, that doesn't mean that we're doing a better job at social cohesion versus Israeli Arab, Druze, and Bedouin sectors, but it does mean that the worst fears of the past year have not come true. And then, of course, there's the Haredi sector, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Israel, which while grieving along with most Israelis over our war losses, is not really a partner in the national defense effort, with exceptions on the fringes of Israeli society. That is, as I'm sure all listeners on this call know, one of the most sensitive issues in Israeli society and politics. It's, to me, one of the most infuriating issues. The bad news here is that I don't see any solutions developing in the short term. Moving the Haredi community out into the world of higher education, gainful modern employment, and eventually some degree of participation in the national defense effort, if not actual military service, is a long-term process. And I don't believe there's any way to force the process forward faster. Yes, it's very possible, and it may be justified to cut the Haredi community off from all aspects of government funding for its community because they don't participate in the national defense effort. But I think we should recognize, I feel, that even that won't help. That is not going to bring the numbers of soldiers into the military that Israel needs, and certainly not in the short term. As I said, Israel needs tens of thousands of more soldiers in the short term, short to medium term, and whatever reforms, adjustments, progress is made versus the ultra-Orthodox community, it's going to be a slow, long process. So that is not the source where we're going to get our soldiers from, not for next week's battles and not for next year's battles, for better or for worse.
So with all of those areas of resilience, if the government, if the army agrees and they pass an allocation and a budget and a process, those can happen. But how does social cohesion, meaning maybe set aside the ultra-Orthodox issue right now, as you seem to be a little pessimistic on that part, but social cohesion through the rest of Israeli society for this war effort, how does that happen?
So you ask a difficult question. Social cohesion is a function of any number of parameters, ranging from a shared national ethos, a shared threat perception, and leadership that knows how to call upon the higher aspirations and commitments of the public. Obviously, when Israeli politics descends into hateful divisions, extreme rhetoric, political infighting, we don't get there. When the prime minister himself is a figure of great controversy and embroiled in many episodes, some of them with criminal implications, pulling together a national cohesion is not an easy task. I sense, nevertheless, and I think you see this in almost every public opinion poll that has been published in recent months or in recent weeks, that the Israeli public, despite all these political differences, the Israeli public understands the enormity of the task ahead of us. And when it comes to kicking in and making the effort, willingness to sacrifice, the numbers are still very high. You may hate Netanyahu or despise Yair Lapid, but most Israelis are nevertheless going to show up for reserve duty in the military, volunteer in many organizations meant to help the displaced and those who are in mourning or otherwise critically affected. And the commitment of the public the fight forward and fight on remains strong. There is strong, I'll call it Zionist ethos that still courses through the veins of most people in this country. And even if it has been dulled somewhat, and desensitized by the bickering and the political infighting, most Israelis are still there when push comes to shove. I don't want to get into here current attempts, the new attempts, or the old attempts to oust Netanyahu over this or that investigation into his office or into his aides or into his own personal contact. I don't want to get into the demand, which will come to fruition at some point for elections to elect or re-elect Israel's leadership. And of course, there is the eventual necessary, eventual national commissions of investigation, which have to look at the failures of October 7th. How that will all play out in terms of Israeli politics remains an open question. Despite all that, and beyond all that, my feeling is, that Israelis still maintain a great degree of social cohesion. And if and when the government comes down with the draconian economic decrees I talked about earlier, in order to rebuild our military and our emergency preparedness, which I think is inevitable, Israelis will bite the bullet and be there.
David, I really appreciate your thoughtful answers to these tough questions. We're running out of time, but we have two very important issues to discuss. We need to discuss wine, but before that, we need to talk about the U.S., the changes that are coming in the U.S., and what your thoughts are about how that impacts U.S. foreign policy and Israel national security.
In short, I think there's no question, at least in my mind, that the election or the re-election of Donald Trump will improve Israel's strategic situation and U.S.-Israel relations, both in the immediate term and over the long term. The appointments that Trump has made in recent days to all the national security and foreign policy positions in the next administration are all very encouraging from Israel's point of view. Trump is not the Messiah, not for America, not for Israel. And I don't think the Trump administration is going to be rushing to approve Israeli annexation, the application of Israeli sovereignty throughout Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, as some people are thinking. Trump has his own priorities: Russia, Ukraine, China, immigration, and so on. And in our region, his priority is normalization with Saudi Arabia. And that will require, inevitably, some Israeli concessions. I think Israel's going to have to play along with Trump. I think Israel's going to have to re-embrace the Trump plan, which talked about some sort of truncated Palestinian state. If Israel plays its cards well, perhaps 2 years from now, perhaps 3 years from now, we'll also be able to make progress on some of the things like the application of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria that many people in the conservative Israeli community are hoping for. But you can't push Trump there off the bat. It's not on top of his list of priorities. We're going to have to work with his team, help him achieve some of his goals, which also are our goals, and then be in a better place to cash in, as it were, down the road.
Thank you, David, for sharing that. Let's talk about the wine before we wrap up the briefing. And we only have 3 minutes to talk about wine, so let's make it very focused if I can. You know, we at IDSF certainly value Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria, in terms of its value of being part of the heartland of Israel and its national strategic importance. So if you had to pick a red wine, a vineyard, a producer in Judea and Samaria to share with us, what would it be?
Number one, buy Israeli wines. And yes, buy wines from Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria. The entire Israeli wine industry has been hard hit by this past year of war. Because many vineyards, particularly in the Golan and the Galilee, were devastated by the war. Vintners were not able to get to many of their vineyards in the north this past winter in order to deal with them, in order to prune them, or to harvest them properly in the fall. So the production is down. Many winemakers and their staffs have been mobilized. The entire industry has been hard pressed. To directly answer your question, buy wines from some of the hardest hit wineries up north: Dalton, Galilee Mountain, Luria, almost all the wineries in the upper and lower Galilee, as well as the upper and central Golan. They've all suffered. Apparently, this past vintage looks like it's going to be a very good vintage. So whether you're buying fresh vintage, young, white, and rosé wines, or you're buying older vintage red wines, this is the time to do it. Pay specific attention, in my view, to the newest trend in Israeli winemaking, which is producing wine from Mediterranean varietals, things like Grenache, Syrah, and Mourvedre, as opposed to the classic French Bordeaux varietals like Cabernet Merlot. I think that's the premium direction of the Israeli wine industry.
Amazing. I'm now thinking with the amount of messages I'm getting, maybe we need to do a pre-Pesach wine buying guide with your advice in a briefing.
Be
Thank you
happy
so
to do
much.
so.
Thank you
And
so much, David, for joining this
but
briefing.
Moshe, then you should send wines to everyone on the IDSF call so that we can all drink at the same time.
Okay, we have many months to plan that logistically, figure out how to do it. It's a great idea. David, thank you so much for joining this briefing. I always learn so much when speaking with you. Thank you to all of our viewers. Thank you to all of our supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you next week, Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.